Hello, my object today is to give a basic overview of the game Killer Angels. I've already given out something I termed a preface, so it's a video sort of looking at the components and the different rule books and just a sort of basic first look at the game as such. Today what I aim to do is to give an overview of the basic game by way of looking at the map, the pieces, the various strength tracks, player aids such as combat results table, and the basic rules. So I've played the game 4 times now using the basic rules. And that's what do we have? We have 26 pages of rules and then some game scenarios. So and then charts and tables, which I have photocopies of here. So what I aim to do is take a closer look at the map and the pieces, and then go through the rule book bit by bit to introduce you to the procedures and the different concepts used in this game. Now, it was kindly brought to my attention that the last video I was sometimes I was speaking too far away from the microphone, which is on my phone. I don't have a separate microphone, so what I said was difficult to hear. So taking that into account, I'm not going to do so much of a static overhead shot of the game as I move around, but there's going to be handheld moments in it as well. So I hope that's better for viewing. Okay, so first, this is the map, and it reaches all the way from Harrisburg up here down to Staunton down here, and we've got Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville here. Off to the side of the map we have boxes for Richmond, Southside, Pennsylvania, Norfolk, etc., and 2 at-sea boxes. They're not used. There's also one for New York City and East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia down here. They're not used in the basic game, so I won't be speaking about them now. You might also note that the map has been doctored, which is what I've done. Is suggested to do in the rules is to cut off the tracks. So this is actually the Union strength track, which sat at the top of the map, and the Confederate strength track and the turn track, which sat at the bottom of the map. The campaign game in the basic game is 22 turns long, starting on June the 15th, which is here, and running to July the 18th, which is here. So that's 22 turns. The full game can go up to 90 turns, so I presume that's in the advanced or campaign game. Now, I cut off the strength tracks for 2 reasons. One is that the game actually suggests that you cut them off because they're meant to be kept secret. And so obviously if they were attached to the map, you know, your opponent could kind of look over and have a look. Also, it just facilitated me, having them both close to me. And it might also be necessary because they're both printed the same way. So if you have opponents on either side of the map, essentially the Union player would have their writing on their tracks upside down. So that's what's happened there. Then you can see from here that the map it's fairly Spartan. It's not too complicated. What we have, these darker patches are impassable mountains. I've actually outlined them in brown felt tip pen myself to make them even more stand out from these lighter brown rough terrain patches. You also have wooded terrain. Then the red lines you can see are roads. There's some crisscrossing hatched lines which are railways, and then you have rivers which become major rivers. Major rivers are impassable, and again I doctored my map by colouring them with more felt tip pen to make them stand out more. The reason being that when I look at a map and I'm planning the campaign, I I need to see those barriers a lot more. I need them to jump out at me a lot more than they did in the original map. I mean, they were distinct enough. I just made it even more visible to my eye. So at the top we have the Susquehanna River, and that's only crossable at two places, here and here, where rail lines cross it. Then we have Baltimore down here coming to Washington, and there's the Potomac, which is impassable all the way up to there. And then down here we have the Rappahannock, which splits in two, finishing there and then continuing in streams which are passable. Now I'll just go in a bit closer to show you here. So I also doctored the impassable major rivers have fords, and also they are passable obviously where roads or railroads cross them. Note that the railroad here, I highlight where the fords occurred. I made them more visible for me as well, because originally they were just these dashed lines. So I coloured them in yellow and put a white line across the river to make them stand out a lot more, so easier to see. I actually put a crossing there, but it doesn't exist. So Fredericksburg, there's a unit missing there. I'd set up ready for so there he is, there's Hill, should be there. This is the start of the basic game, campaign game. You've got Hill here and Hooker here. So Hooker's recovering from Battle of Chancellorsville. A.P. Hill's here in Fredericksburg. And Lee has moved off here with Stuart's cavalry division there. So I presume, I don't know, but I presume the bridge here was destroyed in the Battle of Chancellorsville, or you know, around that time. So that crossing doesn't actually exist. But anyway, so you see, when you have impassable terrain like this, it's only crossable at certain areas here, here, here. And again, Washington you can cross at, but here you can only cross at certain areas. So you can see that also the impassable mountain terrain creates certain choke points. And you've got Ashby's Gap here. This is called Snickers Gap. You've got South Mountain here, Sharpsburg's there. You go up to here, we see this is classed as rough terrain, so there's a mountain here. You've got Emmitsburg and Taneytown here. You've got Baltimore down here, and this is Gettysburg. You can see the rail line coming up to it there. I've marked this with a mnemonic, how do you say that word, here, which reminds me that this department of the Susquehanna, which is settled in Harrisburg, commanded by Couch, or is it Couch, I don't know, Couch, if any of the Confederate division or larger gets this far, within 6 hexes of it, it gets reinforced. So I've brought in a few mnemonics myself just to help me remember some things. So that's the map. Now maybe if I'll just mention the pieces. So every unit has 2 pieces. One goes on the map and one goes on the tracks. Now the units comprise leaders, and normally these would be placed on the map this side up, so their strengths are hidden. Now this is A.P. Hill, and he's always going to be with his headquarters, so in effect these could be one counter, but I guess maybe in the advanced or campaign game they can separate out. So they would normally be placed on the map like this. So, and they would move like this, so your opponent would know if there's a headquarters, a major force perhaps moving. They wouldn't know exactly who was leading it, and they wouldn't know which headquarters it was, of which corps. So on the back that just gives you the information. That's A.P. Hill's corps, and here's Hill. I think I'll go into what the numbers mean later. So these would be on the map like that. Then there's also a depot marker here. You can see in the basic game, depots only count for victory point purposes. There's no supply rules. So here we have a similar situation. I keep them this way up because as I'm playing solo play, you know, I don't need that hidden information. I did play a couple of my games with the information hidden because, you know, it does help to forget who's where or what their abilities are. You know, their sort of chance of that is that corpse likely to react to my movement? What's their chances, etc. But it's not necessary as a solo player. So again, you've got headquarters, the Army of Potomac, Hooker leading it there, and a depot there. So similarly, we've got Lee and his headquarters, Army of North Virginia there. We've got Stuart's, that is actually a cavalry division, but it counts as a corps in this rule set. Functions the same way essentially. So he's got headquarters, leader and headquarters, leader and headquarters. Then down here we have, so normally you would see either these units or headquarters showing, and these indicate pickets. So they have no strength, they're essentially one strength point. And they come in two flavours, cavalry and infantry. In the basic game, they function just the same. And then you have a depot underneath. So you've got some like that also on the depots with pickets guarding them. And okay, we've got another leader there. So that's Trimble with the Department of... Is that the Department of the Valley? Yes. Okay, and then up here, just to show you, this is actually, so it's not a corps with a leader, it's just Imboden's cavalry. That's in fact a brigade, because he's from Stuart's cavalry. But if that was an infantry unit, like it is here, on the Union side, that's actually a division. So that division has become unattached from its superior leader. All units that are attached mean they are in the same hex, and so they're not placed on the board. They just say, let's give an example. Yeah, so here's Stuart. Now Imboden's brigade there is subordinate to Stuart, meaning it's part of his command, but it's not attached to him. So the rest of Stuart's command are attached to him. They're not on the map. They are on the strength track here. So this is the grey tracks, the Confederate strength tracks. You can see this here is Stuart's, and you can see it's got notations for both corps and division, so depending on which rule set you're using. So here you have Stuart's track marker. You can see it doesn't go on the map, so it doesn't have the profile on it, and you can see it has a different set of numbered figures on it. Then these are the other brigades. You see there's Imboden's, and I put this mnemonic on it for me to remind me that it is not attached. So these are all subordinate to Stuart. All of them are attached except for Imboden. So this is marking their strengths. So for W. Jones and Roberts and the others, there's similar markers as to Imboden's over there, but I'm keeping them in my counter trade there. Okay, so the strengths tracks work in two ways. One is that when you have a brigade or division, and even in the advanced game you can get regiments, it will mark the strength of that unit. So Imboden's is at strength 4. If we go over here, we can see the flip side of one of those counters, which indicates it's 10 plus. So Anderson is on 15 strength points. Now the other thing you use on the track for is for the leaders. There's A.P. Hill, and in the middle he has a 3. That indicates that he has 3 action points. Action points are what you spend to perform actions, movement and combat in a turn. So Hill, and other actions as well, like cutting rail lines, reacting and so forth. So Hill has 3 action points, so when he's activated you can also, the leader will go on here. It's not the leader's strength, but it's their action points remaining, and count them down as he uses them. So that's the strength tracks, and you can see that I put cubes here to remind that these ones are not in use. So in the basic game, we don't need all the strength tracks. Like, for example, we have the Army of the Potomac here under Hooker. And then underneath there's space for a second army, then also a left Grand Division, centre Grand Division, and right Grand Division. So the Union would have the luxury of creating Grand Divisions of their army if they so wished. Now, in terms of subordination, we generally have, like Lee here, I put him on his 8. He has 8 action points. He needs lots of action points in order to activate his subordinates. So the army leaders are always considered activated. If Lee wants to activate one of his subordinates, for example Stuart, he has to check his command range. I might as well show you that now. So the command range is the number up in the top right, that's 8. So if Stuart was within 8 hexes, not counting going over impassable hex sites, he can activate him, and that will cost 1 point. So Lee's always active, it's his turn. So we put him at 8, move him down 1, and he activates Stuart. Now Stuart's activated, so Stuart will move here to his 6 points, and then he can decide what to do. He might spend, say, 1 action point to move himself, or he might spend 1 action point to move one of his attached or subordinate units. The attached are fine, he can just do that and move one of them away. The subordinate he can activate to move as long as it's within his command range. And we see Stuart's also got a magnificent command range of 8 as well. Just a quick look to show what they're up against. Pleasanton, who is the cavalry commander on the Union side, has a command range of 0. So his guys are all going to stick together. And okay, that's nothing you need to know right now. So so that's what happens. Now, while I'm at it, I might as well quickly remark that on here they also have on the bottom right an initiative value. So Lee's is 7, Stuart's is 6, Hooker's is 6, and Pleasanton's is 5. Now that is that, say if Pleasanton was out of Hooker's range of 8, Hooker couldn't activate him. But he could try and activate himself. He would have to roll 5 or under on a 1d6. And there's at times when that is modified slightly, which would then make Lee's initiative of 7 make sense. So if Pleasanton activated himself, normally you can see he's got an AP value of 1. So if Hooker had activated him, and it's only Hooker who can, because Hooker's his superior, Pleasanton would go there. But if he activates himself as a self-activation, you get 1 point extra. Now that is necessary because movement only costs 1 action point, but moving, for example, your headquarters over a stream costs an extra action point. So Pleasanton would need 2 action points to do that. Otherwise his headquarters just wouldn't get across the stream. Now you might ask, okay, so if he's activated by Hooker, he's only got 1 action point. How is he ever going to move his headquarters across the stream? Well, in that case, he's activated by Hooker. He's in range of Hooker. So Hooker, who starts out with 10 action points, because he's going to have to do a lot of ordering subordinates around, Hooker can spend his action points, 1, 2, for example, and that would enable Pleasanton to move his headquarters over that river. So you can see, depending on the leaders, certain things they're only going to be able to do if they are commanded directly by their superior. For example, Pleasanton moving the max, if he self-activates, the maximum APs he can have is 2. But to move your headquarters across a ford, it costs 2 action points, and that's in addition to the 1 action point to move. So Pleasanton will never be able to take his headquarters across a ford by himself. He's always going to need Hooker to lend him an action point to do that. So we begin to see already some of the processes that this game requires in terms of command and control. And again, it's nearly always modelled that way, is it not, that the Confederates have better freedom of movement in those kind of terms, whilst the unions are tighter and more cumbersome in that terms. So it costs each side the same action points to move, but the way in which they have to be doled out and the abilities of the individual leaders are quite different between the two sides. And while I'm about it, I might as well mention the movement, because basically every on map counter except for headquarters moves two hexes. So Hill could move 2 hexes, it doesn't matter what form of terrain it is or so forth. A picket could move 2 hexes. Imboden's cavalry brigade could move 2 hexes. But if Hill moved 2 hexes and he had activated his headquarters to move separately, it could only move 1 hex. So if you're moving with your headquarters, you're moving slower than normal. Now, if you're moving on a road, you get a road bonus. The Confederates get 2 hexes road bonus, the Union only 1. What that means is that if Hooker's running up this road with his whole army in his headquarters, he could move 1 hex because he's keeping his headquarters with him, and then 1 hex extra for the road bonus. If Lee's running up here with his army's headquarters, he moves 1 hex, and then he gets 2 hexes bonus. You can see that's a big difference, which enables the Confederate army to move faster. Now, if Lee had left his headquarters behind, okay, so his leader's going to have to stay, but say he sends out Longstreet's corps. Longstreet's corps could leave its, or a division, let's say Pickett's. Pickett's, hang on, I need that on map. Counter. Okay. So they're all the same, so it doesn't really matter on that side. So Pickett's division could move 2 hexes because it's not a headquarters unit, and then 2 more for the road bonus. And the Union, if Hooker sent out a division, it's only going to move 2 hexes and then 1 more. So you see how that movement works and the advantages for the Confederates in that respect. And yes, so if it doesn't matter, so the movement range is always the same, but the action point cost is different. So if you're moving over a ford, you're moving and going over a ford, so it's a net 3 movement points to move 1 or 2, depending on the unit headquarters or non-headquarters you're using. So it doesn't matter in that sense that you're moving through woods, except headquarters, they find all terrain a bit more difficult. So if a non-headquarters crosses a ford, it only costs 1 movement point. So the Union division could move 2 hexes, costing 2, I said movement point, I meant action point, costing 2 action points to the leader who's commanding that division. Now notice that if Hooker was sending this unit, so 1, 2 hexes, it's Hooker who spends the action points. This division does not have its own action points. It could be that you use the action points of the commander of the corps or Hooker. It depends on your choice how you want to spend out those action points. So, and then if the headquarters goes across, it's going to just move 1 hex, and that's going to cost Hooker 3 action points. If headquarters cross a bridge, they pay extra. If headquarters move in woods or rough, they pay extra. And if they cross a minor river, so there's no bridge, no ford or anything, that costs 3 extra action points. So to move the headquarters from here to here, that would be 4 action points, which is the most you're ever going to spend in movement. And you can see that would cost Hooker almost half, and it would cost Lee half of his action point expenditure in one turn. And that is important because you get a chance to move more than once in a turn, potentially up to 5 times. So you want to be saving action points for some of those potentials if you want to move fast. And if you're bringing your headquarters of a corps or an army across a river, a river without a minor river, without a bridge or a ford, it's going to cost you a lot of organisation, or in this game action points, to do it. So that already has given you a big insight into how this game functions in terms of in terms of the basic game. There's more detail and there's a lot more in it in the advanced and the campaign game, but essentially that's, and there's a lot more also in the basic game, but that is the nuts and bones. You have subordination and attachment, then you have action points which need to be spent, and then the movement and how headquarters and non-headquarters units differ from that. So you can see it's already about do I detach units, keeping some back with my headquarters in reserve to get further to where I want, or do we move at the fastest speed of a headquarters, keeping up with our whole supply chain and so forth. When do I send out pickets, etc.? Detaching, because any unit can detach a picket, provided that it has a leader to spend the action point to do so. And we'll explain why pickets are necessary a bit later. So the key things to remember so far is that every unit has 2 markers. One's on the map and one's on the strength tracks. If it's attached, it's in the same hex and it's on the strength track. If it's detached, it has to be within command range of its superior leader, or even a superior of that superior. So for example, the leader of the army rather than the leader of the corps, to which it's directly subordinate, for action points to be spent to move it. Without that, both pickets can always be subordinate to any leader in range, but pickets and detached brigades or divisions require a roll of 1 or 2. They're considered to have their individual initiative of 1 or 2, and they will get 1 action point. So they won't be crossing any. They could not cross a ford on their own, but they could cross a bridge, a bridged terrain. Then a key point to note is that headquarters have their own unit and they move slower than all the other units, and they cost a lot more in action points to move. And already there you can see keys of the game. Now, next point I think to notice, just in a quick general overview, is that you have 2 combat tables. You have what's called a skirmish table, and you have a battle table. Now the skirmish table, both combat tables work in terms of strength points firing. So there's no odds ratio. You essentially have a phased firing, and depending on certain factors, one or other side may fire first. It's not necessarily always the one who moved into the hex, i.e. the nominal attacker, who's going to go second or first. It depends. In the skirmish, generally it is the attacker, the one who moved into the hex, who goes first, because they're kind of considered, surprising the other fellow. But you can see that. So this is strength points firing, maximum of 11 in the skirmish. Maximum you're going to get is 2 strength points lost, and it's attacker, defender. Often 0, sometimes 1, sometimes 0-0 on both sides. Because that's a skirmish. Now, within certain conditions, it's your choice whether you have a skirmish or a battle, or in fact, it could be nothing. Each hex is 5 miles across. So you can have units of the opposing sides in the same hex, and although they will have to go to either skirmish and or battle, they can both decide to not do anything and so effectively sort of ignore each other, or maybe even just entrench. But given that, you're going to have to go through the skirmish routine at least, but prior to that contact routine, and we'll get to that, and you might go all the way to the battle. So a battle, again, it's the same, it's based on strength points firing, so both sides get to fire sometimes simultaneously. Same with skirmish, and you're going all the way from 0 up to 15 strength, your opponent losing 15 strength points. So you can see how that is going to affect when you have on the strength tracks, the maximum division can be as 10 strength points. You could skirmish, or you could have, it's obviously going to be rare because you're rolling on a d6, but you have various additions. For example, if you're attacking from a march, you get a -5, but you can add a leader's bonus in. Lee has a combat bonus, which is on the off map counter of 10, so you could potentially roll a 6, add 10, and with no minuses get a 16. I'm not sure how you're going to get 17 at the moment. Oh yes, because you can add 2 leaders combat bonuses, so you could get drastic losses in a battle, but both sides could get it. So it's not going to be like in a CRT where you might have Ray shows classic CRT where say you have an engaged result and they both take kind of equal losses, or one loses everything, the other loses the equivalent, but you might both lose the same amount depending on this, or different depending on the strengths and your luck on the die, or on the leaders. There's a few other factors. So I think essentially what I'm saying is it's your choice. You can either skirmish in battle or go to battle. It's full-on battle can be very costly. Skirmish is quite light in terms of strength points lost. So with those basic nuts and bolts spoken of, let's move on to the procedures in a bit more depth. Now the first thing to mention is the sequence of play. It always starts with an initiative phase, and that is where the Confederate chooses whether the Union or themselves are going to go first in the turn. That's always the Confederate player's choice. Then you move on to the movement phase. That's followed by the second player's free reaction phase. Then there's a forced march phase, and then there's a battle phase. After that you go to the second player's turn, and then you end up with a game turn interphase, which comprises a Union politics segment, a marker adjustment segment, and the game turn and victory point calculation record segment. So let's go into that in a bit more detail, but basically you can see it's not and even in the advanced and the campaign game there's not a hell lot more added to the sequence of play, but there are a couple of routines that can be activated within that, depending essentially when you move into an enemy's hex. So you've determined who's going to take the initiative. Let's say Confederates have said the Union's going to go first. So their first player's turn starts with battle continuation. Now this is your choice if you're in the same hex as an opponent and you had battled at the last turn, not skirmished but battled. So that is to enable you to, for example, recreate Gettysburg. You can have a 3-day battle using that battle continuation phase. And this is crucial. If you choose to do that, then you lose the whole of the rest of your turn. You move straight to the end of the player turn, which is the battle phase. Now I think I'm just going to zoom in here where I've put a little mnemonic for me to help me. It is on one of the player aid charts, but it helped me to be able to mark it with a marker to say where we are in the game turn phase. So you can see that initiative starts here, and I use these to show, okay, who's going to go first, Union or Confederate. Then you go to battle continuation. Now if you were battling, you choose battle continuation, you skip all the rest of it and you move straight to the battle part of your player turn. That means that the rest of your units are not going to be able to move nor force march, except as part of the battle phase there is a call to arms. Kind of march to the sound of the guns. So any unit within 6 hexes is able to move, I think it's 2 hexes, towards them and perhaps into the battle and join it in later rounds. But if you do not choose or don't have the option to continue a battle, you would go to move. Now move essentially is what I showed before. You will look at your units on the map, you will activate certain units. Okay, Hooker is already activated. He's got 10 activation points. Is he going to activate himself, move his headquarters and all of his army together, or is he going to detach some units, send them off with their own orders using activation points? Is he going to activate one of his subordinates in his range and they're all going to move? You do all that, and you do it as and how you wish, in the order you wish, and any unit that is in their superior's range cannot roll for initiative. So you can only roll for initiative activation if you're out of a superior range. So you can also do that, and that doesn't have to be done last. You could do that at the beginning. It's up to you. Now, I have to spend a bit of time on this because we need to go more into what is possible to do in the so-called move phase, because then what I think I should show now is the administrative points cost summary. Now, how can I do this best? I have to take it out of without letting my camera fall down, which it's going to. I'll take this out of the Perspex standee. I've got it in. This is actually on the back of the basic rule book, but I've photocopied it out to colour code it so it's a bit better for me to see what's going on. And there is another way it could have actually been done a lot better, which is that this is the administrative points cost. Now it goes all from continuation of multi-day battle. So that battle continuation would have cost 2 action points. Movement costs 1. Then you've got these difficult terrains for generally for headquarters extras. Entrenchment costs 1. Cutting a rail line costs 3 action points. And repairing a rail line costs 1 action point. So for example, you could move a unit on the map and cut a rail line. So that's going to cost 4 action points, but that all happens within the movement turn and the activation of that unit. If instead you entered enemy hex, you could initiate a skirmish. That actually costs no action points in a certain condition, but it costs 2 action points if you do it in a battle phase. So, or you can escalate to battle, which costs 2 action points. Initiate battle costs 2 action points, or 3 in another phase. Activate a subordinate costs 1. Withdraw from battle costs 2 action points. So you can see it might be tempting to use all your action points of a unit to I don't know, maybe move, cut a rail line, or start where you are, cut a rail line, move into an enemy hex and initiate a battle. That's going to cost a certain number of action points. If you don't have 2 left on your track, or within your superior, within range, does not have 2 left, you will not have the option to withdraw from that battle if it doesn't go your way, or if you find that the force you're facing was bigger than you expected. So it's handy to bear that in mind. At the end of battle, there's always a free withdrawal. So that at the end of a day of battle, because each turn is a day, you can always withdraw for free. So you don't have to end up in the hex. But in that case, you have conceded the battle, and your opponent's considered to have won. you can call for support in the battle. That's what I mentioned before. So you need an action point for that, so save an action point in your battle for that contingency. And you can also modify the withdrawal table roll. So if you want to withdraw from battle, you expend the 2 action points, and you could modify the roll because it's not a given. And then also Hooker, if he saves any action points in the end of after both player turns, in the interphase, game turn interphase portion, he can modify a politics roll by any action points he has left. So I think because we're just going through sequence of play, I won't get into detail about how skirmishes and battles start yet. So anyway, that's what the kind of things you can do in movement. You can move, you can cut or repair rail lines. You could, having entered an enemy hex, either just initiate a skirmish or even escalate to a battle. And if you do at that point escalate to battle, again you move straight to the battle phase, and any units that you hadn't already moved won't get a movement. They won't get force march. That's the opponent's free reaction in your game turn, your player turn, and you go to the battle. So again, if they're within 6 hexes, that they could get a chance to move if you have an action point left to call them in. But otherwise, that's the end. That's the end of the rest of your turn. So it behooves you to time your movements. If you know you want to battle, but you move all your other units first before the unit that you're going to battle with. So anyway, say you haven't moved to battle, maybe you've just had a skirmish or nothing like that. Then, and you've moved all the units, they can only move once in a day in this phase. You've done all that. Next you move to free reaction. Now what happens in this is that your opponent then gets any unit which is within the reaction range, and I'll just quickly show you Trimble's on map counter here. So that's the bottom left number, the reaction range. Generally it's 2, like Lee and Hooker have 2. I think there's somebody that has 3. Can't remember which, but often it's 1 and sometimes 0. So it's not a huge reaction range, but essentially what that means in the free reaction phase is that if any enemy unit is within that range of a leader or that leader who can spend action points, then you can move in your opponent's phase. Now it's a little bit more, there's a little bit more to it than that, but I'll get to that in a minute. Then so that's the enemy. They can just move 1 unit by free reaction, and they can use by non-free reaction in your movement phase. Then you go to force march, and essentially that's just the same as movement, so all your units could move again if you still have action points left to enable them to do so. But if you do that in the basic game, essentially they just get a force march marker on them, and that's just to mnemonic to remind you that they cannot force march 2 turns, i.e. 2 days in a row. So that's just a basic whole movement phase all over again with that penalty. And then you would go to battle. So maybe battle's not going to, it's not an automatic phase, so you only need to engage in the battle phase if a battle occurred. A battle's only going to occur in the movement or the forced march phase, or indeed in the enemy free reaction. So then you just move up to the battle phase and resolve it. So if the movements have not resulted in a battle, we just skip that, and then it goes to the next player turn. He performs them in order, and then we go to the game turn interphase. So the game turn interphase, that starts with the Union Politics segment. Now in the basic game that's quite simple. In the advanced I understand there's a lot more to it, in that you have generals. There's 3 kind of political directions on the Union side. It's only Union Politics, I think, in the advanced game that come into it. And so, you know, certain generals could be promoted or demoted or withdrawn, etc., depending on which political parties in the ascendancy at that time. But anyway, in the basic game, it's just a simple table like this. And essentially what happens is you roll a 1d6, and if Hooker has any action points left, he can modify it. It is also modified by -3 if a Confederate corps is within 3 hexes of Washington, or another -3 if the Confederates have scored a victory against the Army of the Potomac in Maryland. So on a -2 or less, the Confederates get 10 victory points. On an adjusted 11 or more, the Union get 5 victory points. And that happens every turn. So essentially, and I did work this out, there's a whole list of victory points. We'll get to that in a minute. But essentially, if Hooker sits down and does nothing, he has 10 action points every turn he could spend. So he's guaranteed rolling a 1 on a d6 plus 10 means he's going to get 5 victory points every turn for doing nothing. Over 22 turns, that's a lot of victory points, but meanwhile, the Confederate will be running around cutting rail lines surrounding Washington, etc., maybe taking Harrisburg and accruing lots of victory points on their own. But it does mean that, you know, if Hooker's not able to do much in terms of moving his units, he does get time to placate Lincoln, I guess, and score some victory points politically wise. Because the campaign wasn't really about, and I think this is the premise of the game. Lee's intention was to take his army north. It wasn't to destroy the Army of the Potomac. I guess Hooker's aim was to have been to destroy Lee's army, but him and feeling sort of more or less not up to it. At the minimum, he had to defend Washington and kind of, you know, keep down the harassment of Lee. So I think Lee intended to score kind of morale points, grand strategic morale points, and maybe political points for his side, rather than a major military goal in his campaign. And I think that is the basic premise of the game, judging by the victory points and the fact that the Union player can just play the political game by not managing much militarily, but still managing, but still gaining some credit just for having a force in the field. So after that, the Union politics segment. In the game interface, we get the leader restoration segment. So that's simply moving all your leaders back to the end of the action track so they are refreshed for next turn. Then the mark removal, essentially that's flipping the markers indicating forced march, so they don't stay on too long. And then the game turn record segment, where you move the game turn on a notch, and you count the victory points. So I'll just mention at this point that in the basic game, interestingly, each game turn lasts 2 days. Now there is a game turn track marker somewhere, but it's just the standard size. Oops. Like this, because in the advanced game each game turn is only 1, but because of some certain movement restrictions in the basic game, or more greater freedom of movement in the advanced game, it was necessary for the basic game to make movement restrictions, less freedom of movement in the advanced game. It was necessary to compensate for that to make the basic game turn equal to 2 days rather than the normal 1. So that gives you a sense already of the game. It was sort of designed at an advanced level, and it was simplified to make a more playable game in the basic game. So they had to stretch the game turn for that, and didn't give a marker to handle that easily. You can imagine having to remember to jump 2 every time, so I just did that. So that brings us then to the victory points table, victory point summary, which is all important. So you will run through it like this. So for each Confederate strength point the Union has eliminated, they get 1 victory point. And you note that the Confederates, for every 3 Union, they get 2. So, on even battle, the Union's going to be scoring more points for obvious reasons, their greater manpower to expend. Now we start seeing the basic Union objectives. They have to keep the rail lines between Washington and Harrisburg and Washington and Cumberland open. Now, because Ewell starts here, this is Harper's Ferry here, so not a huge force defending it. The general movement is for Ewell to come here, maybe attack Harper's Ferry, send them out, seize the depot there and cut the rail line here. And then Lee is probably going to move up and maybe threaten Harrisburg, but definitely cut the rail line here. And I found in my 4th play that then it makes sense you've got Hill here, for Hill to move up here and then Lee to move down here, or it might be the other way, Lee stays here and Ewell moves down here and surround Washington. But anyway, so if those rail lines are not cut, the Union gets 2 victory points each game for each game turn that they are not cut. Now, if Pennsylvania is marked by a line here, if that's free of a Confederate division or larger, then Union get 2 per game turn. If Pennsylvania and Maryland stretches from the Pennsylvania border essentially to the Potomac. If both are free, then the Union get 4 per game turn. They also get 10 points for capturing Confederate depots. Now that's a Union consideration because there's a depot here. If Hill moves away, does he guard the depot? There's also a depot here and a depot here. So the Union could gain 30 victory points taking those. But, Hooker, is he going to move that way and try and get those? Or is he going to move up here to try and counter any of Lee's moves? He can't do both. And if he sends one of his sub-commanders off to do that or that, they do not have great initiative ratings, so they're not going to be activating every turn. They will be moving fairly slowly. And another consideration is that if the Union has 90 plus, which is the Army of the Potomac strength at the beginning, more than 90, stays in Virginia, he gets 2 game turns. So that is staying south of the Potomac. We have Virginia all the way down in the rest of the map here. West Virginia up here, that doesn't count. And it's interesting that it took me a couple of games to notice, but there's actually, these dotted lines are the regional boundaries. This area is not listed, so it's neither West Virginia, nor is it Maryland, nor Virginia. I don't know if that is a distinct separate region at the time, or if it's just for the game sense, in that no one gets victory points or adjustments for having units in there necessary for the game play. So that's how the Union's going to gain victory points, and of course any rolls on the politics table which we saw previously. So you can see that with 22 game turns, if you're not going to keep Lee or Lee's men out of both Pennsylvania and Maryland for long, you might keep them out of Pennsylvania for a bit longer, or more likely they might not go there straight away. But you're going to have rail lines cut, you're going to have to be repairing them all the time, but either units will be out of range and so they may or may not get to do that, or you're spending activation points to do that you might need to enter battle, etc, etc. So that's the Union decisions, and that's where they gain their victory points. So you see, if you destroy a division at 15 strength points, such as like 16 for Hoods, you will get 16 victory points. But that's going to be a heavy battle. You're going to be taking a lot of losses too. So yes, you'll gain some victory points on parity against the Confederates, but it's not the best way to gain victory points. The best way is to keep these going game turn after game turn. What's the Confederate doing? Well, if the Army of Northern Virginia is north of the Potomac, you gain 1 for every game turn. If someone's in West Virginia, you gain 1. If someone's in Maryland, you gain 3. Not cumulative with West Virginia. So go to West Virginia, that's a turn or 2. Then get to Maryland, after a turn or 2. Get to Pennsylvania, 5 victory points per game turn. But what that means is that Lee will have to use leave at least a division up here for, I don't know, let's say for sake of argument 15, 17 game turns to gain a lot of victory points. If it's not the whole of the Army of Northern Virginia, then that's going to be a tempting target for Hooker to eventually get up to and smash with his army. If it is the bulk of Lee's army, then he's not going to be able to do the rest of the stuff. So, for example, if Washington cannot trace an open rail line, and essentially this rail line ends up nowhere. So if you're blocking this rail line, maybe you've cut it or you've actually got forces on the rail lines. Washington's supplies